Right, it's 11 o'clock. I see a few more people joining us, but we should get going. So, welcome everyone to today's session. Today, in conjunction with Conveyancing Data Services, we've actually decided to try out a little bit of a mini-series this month. So we've got a little flood mini-series in 3 parts happening this month. So part 1 is today, and then we've got parts 2 and 3, and then over the course of the next 2 weeks. So as always, a little bit of housekeeping before I get going. You should see a control panel on your screen, which allows you to ask written questions. Please feel free to submit these as we go along, and I'll try and get these answered either during or after the webinar. We are also recording today's session, as well as a copy of the slides will be made available should you want them. So please get in touch with us afterwards, and we can send both the recording and the slides over to you. We've also got a feedback survey that will launch at the end of the webinar, and we'd really appreciate it if you take a few seconds to help give us a bit of feedback. Some of you may be in the office now, some of you may still be working from home. I am working from home. Hopefully you can all hear me clearly and we have no technical issues today. Part 1, as you would expect, we're going to start at the basics. So really, we're going to be looking at the very, very basics of flooding, give you a really good overview of sort of flood risk in general, and then we'll take a look at the different types of flood risks that we look at and evaluate in our reports and how they fall into environmental reports. So let's get started. So of course, what is flooding? I think it's fairly self-explanatory. I'd like to think you're all very familiar with the natural phenomenon of flooding. The UK has a lot of natural aspects and features which actually kind of make it perfect for flooding under the right conditions. We've got factors like very wet weather, climate change, the type of ground and the ground composition and the topography of the land. That all plays into flood risk all over the country. Over thousands of years, we have manipulated water features, rivers, banks, etc., some to the good and some to the bad. Things like chopping down trees and urbanization, all of those play a factor in flood risk and how the soil and the land can actually absorb water. And of course, as our cities and our populations are growing, we are looking further at building and housing in floodplains to house the growing population. And this is something we'll cover off sort of a little bit later on down the line. And as flood events increase in frequency and intensity, it's going to impact us as a population even more and more in the future. So, it can occur everywhere. It can occur to different types of properties. And there's a lot of common misconceptions about flood risk only happening if you're close to the coast or next to a body of water, and that's not entirely true. So in England and Wales, there's an estimated 5.9 million properties at risk of flooding. So this equates to roughly 1 in 6 homes. If you break that down even further, you're looking at 2.7 million properties at risk of river and coastal flooding. You're looking at 3.2 million properties at risk of surface water flooding, and you're looking at 500,000 properties at risk of both. Additionally, we're not just talking about flood risk to residential properties or commercial properties. We're also talking about flood risk to major pieces of infrastructure that our society needs. 55% of water treatment plants are at risk of some type of flood risk. So a person's property may not be directly impacted by flood risk, but it could be cut off to important essential things like water treatment, clean running water, or even electricity. 14% of electricity infrastructure is at risk. Over 2,000 schools are at risk of flood risk. And of course, the cost of how we manage and maintain flood risk is increasing every year, and depending on how wet or dry the year is. So now let's take a look at the different types of flooding. So the more obvious ones would be river flooding. Everybody knows what river flooding looks like. It happens when the water normally flowing within the channel of the river, of course, increases or overflows. it breaks its banks and it spreads out into the surrounding land. So this is a major cause of issues, of course, for people living in close proximity to a river. Some of the physical causes of flooding are things like heavy rainfall or prolonged periods of rain. In some parts of the country, snow melt, and also the topography of the ground, how steep the ground is, et cetera. That all plays into factors of for river flooding. Things like impermeable rock. So the type of ground near, in and around riverbanks also matters, because if it can't absorb any water, it's going to flow over it. So you've got, as I mentioned earlier, 2.7 million properties are at risk of river and coastal flooding. Human factors are also increasing the risk of river flooding in the country and all around the world. Changes to our rural and urban landscapes also mean that rain is hitting the ground at much higher speeds and taking much longer to drain away, leading to an increased risk of flooding. Things like urbanization, the increases the risk of flooding, because when towns and cities have impermeable surfaces, lots of cement, lots of clay, urbanization means more surfaces of concrete and tarmac, which of course the water can't sink into, and precipitation can't absorb, and it's all being channeled. Things like deforestation and cutting down of trees really also increases flood risk factors. So because it increases runoff, and it really just doesn't help. So all of those things come into play. And here, let's take actual look at an example of river and coastal, river flooding. So in this case, this is Fish Lake. So Fish Lake was one of the most severely hit areas throughout the winter of 2019-2020. Pictures of the flooded village could be found all over the news, often highlighting the dismay of the local community, with images of local residents wading through flooded homes and streets. And Fish Lake became the focal point of the flooding that winter, as the Environment Agency and the government received some criticism in their handling of the particular crisis. Residents were told by the Environment Agency at 5 p.m. on the 8th of November that their homes weren't going to flood and not to go and source sandbags. However, this, of course, appeared to be misjudged, as water flooded homes and streets of the village just a few hours later, and residents were quite outraged with the lack of response and the handling of the flooding there. The Environment Agency confirmed that Fish Lake was hit by a combination of flooding from the River Don spilling into the local floodplain, as well as surface water flooding. So the interaction of a number of sources of water and flooding, and the exact nature and timing of flooding, makes the impacts of flooding really difficult to model and predict. Absolutely, we're getting a lot better at modeling these types of things, but of course, we're learning over time. Unfortunately, measuring river flow rates and managing flood conditions are extremely difficult and challenging, especially when a large flood event is actually happening. Now, the image that you see on the screen is some of the data that we use in our residential reports. So the image features the Environment Agency data set of risk of flooding from rivers and the sea, or we call it the ROFRAS data. This data set shows the chance of flooding from rivers and or the sea, and you can see that there was a high risk of flooding in the area prior to the flood events of that winter. And of course, so there you see, so you've got the purple, the light blue, and of course the red, and that is the corresponding area. So in this particular flood incident, 700 people had to leave their homes. Many were unable to return for several weeks, and the army were actually deployed to help with the evacuation effort and the distribution of sandbags, in addition to assisting the Environment Agency with large-scale pumping operations. So that's an example. And as we go through these different types of flood risks and these specific examples of the types of flooding, you'll actually start to see a pattern of it's not necessarily just one type of flooding that impacts these places. It tends to be multiple, and that's when it really gets areas into trouble. Next, moving on to coastal flooding. Simply put, coastal flooding is when an area of the coast is flooded by the sea. Makes sense. The cause of such a surge could be things like a severe storm or storm wind that pushes water up and creates a lot of waves. The worst coastal flooding tends to occur when the peak storm surge coincides with something like a high spring tide. So the flood starts when waves move inland on an undefended coast, or overtop or breaching coastal defenses that we may have in place. One characteristic of coastal flood is water level dropping and rising with the tide. So at high tide, the water may flow in, and at low tide, it'll recede again. When a sea defense is breached, low tide is the time to repair that breach. So once it overtops in the breach and breaches the defenses, the sea enters very, very quickly, but does slow down. So there's good and bad kind of benefits to coastal flooding. So here, let's just take a good example look at coastal flooding, and in this case, we're using example of Hull. So the terrible consequences of flooding have been, of course, well documented in this area in recent times. You had flood events more recently in 2007, where over 9,000 homes and businesses were affected by a flood event, which devastated the city. More recently, we're looking at 2013, where a storm surge in the Humber estuary caused flooding to over 400 properties across Hull and East Yorkshire. And Hull and the surrounding Humber region has an 800-year history of flooding. Around 90% of the region lies below the high tide line, making the Humber one of the most at-risk regions for flooding in the country. And water comes from all directions in Hull. It makes it uniquely vulnerable to flooding. And that was from the Emeritus Professor of Geography, Lynn Frostick, who's an expert in Britain's estuaries, and she's also an advisor to the Environment Agency on flooding. And Hull's at risk from the North Sea. You, of course, have rainfall, and Hull's kind of like a big basin with the taps on full if it's raining hard. It basically overflows quite often. And there are also risks from groundwater flooding in parts of the city. So if you asked for planning permission to put Hull where it is now, you would probably have been refused. And so, again, like looking at that coastal flood data, and you look at this, and it's just apparent that it tends to happen quite a lot, and it's very, very unfortunate. Now moving on to surface water flooding. So surface water flooding is probably one of the biggest risks of all. It's caused when the volume of rainwater doesn't drain away fast enough through the existing drainage system, or it doesn't soak into the ground, but it actually lies on top and flows over the ground instead. And this type of flooding is usually very short-lived and is associated with heavy downpours of rain and thunderstorms. And surface water flooding is a risk because of its reach. Of all the flood risks that affect us, it is surface water flooding which threatens more people and properties than any other form of flood risk. You're looking at over 3 million properties in England and Wales which are at risk of surface water flooding. So that's even more than river and coastal flooding. Surface water flooding is a risk because of the effect it has on our society. It hits not just individual homes and businesses, but whole pieces of infrastructure like road, rail, utilities of a town or a city, disrupting pretty much all aspects of modern life. And typically after heavy rain, when you see water pooling either in fields or on roads, this is actually surface water flooding. And so here we'll take a look at some surface water flooding in London and Birmingham. So back in June 2016, parts of the country were struck by serious flash floods. Starting on the 7th of June, thunderstorms caused intense rainfall in many locations across the country, particularly in the north of England, as well as London, and caused repeat flash floods in several locations on a daily basis, as you can see here. And that's what our surface water flood data looks like with the various different color gradients. In 2018, the Maybank holiday floods hit 126 roads and impacted on 1,600 homes all across Birmingham, according to a council report into the emergency of that year. And hundreds of homes in Selly Park and Spark Hill were deluged, and many streets were submerged as an average month's rain fell in just an hour on the evening of May 27th back in 2018. So, scenes like this do happen, and unfortunately, it is surface water flooding that tends to happen quite a lot in our cities. And then, of course, moving finally on to groundwater. So groundwater flooding is defined as the emergence of groundwater at the ground surface away from the perennial river channels or the rising of groundwater into man-made ground under conditions where the normal ranges of groundwater level and groundwater flow are exceeded. What does that actually really mean? It's basically we have a water table that sits underneath the ground. When it rains, that water table will rise, and it will, of course, sometimes come up above the surface. Groundwater typically occurs after intense periods of rainfall. As excess water drains into the ground, the aquifers become saturated, the water table rises. It tends to come out at the ground surface or at topographical low spots. So if you have an underground structure or a subsurface asset like a basement or an underground car park, you tend to see groundwater appear in those areas first. Groundwater flooding tends to be much more persistent than surface water flooding or river flooding, and in some cases it can last for weeks, if not months, and it can result in significant damage to property because that water has nowhere else to go other than up. So if you have a lot of wet weather that goes in consecutive order, groundwater can stick around for a very long time. We always advise people if there is a groundwater risk and you do have a subsurface asset, there are waterproofing measures you can put in place for places like basements. You need to check whether or not the basement's been tanked or lined. A lot of the time with basements or like underground car parks, they get groundwater issues if the waterproofing measures may have failed. So it's always worth investigating that. And groundwater levels have slowly been rising for many years in cities like Birmingham and London because less water is actually being pumped from wells and boreholes than earlier in the 20th century. And to give you an example of groundwater flooding a little bit close to home, that's actually my garden. So this was from earlier this year. I am renting a property and ran a flood report on the house that we're living in, and there is a groundwater problem, as you can see on the map on the right-hand side, and it's firmly in the back half of the property where the garden is. So that is rising groundwater. Thankfully, the grass is fake. So excuse the terrible photo of my garden, but that is an example of very real life practical cases of groundwater flooding. And then I just thought I'd show you one more kind of case from something a little bit more recent as well. So, you know, we all knew about Storm Kristoff that happened earlier in January. So this is in Bridgenorth. You can see on this image, there's some surface water sitting around the Severn Park area in Bridgenorth. And that's basically where the red circle is. You can see little bits of shaded surface water. Now, I want to show you all this to show you the different layers of flood risk in this area. Next, in this image, this is groundwater flooding. And again, you can see the area where Severn Park is also has a groundwater flood risk. And then when you take into account this, which is the river flooding, and then you put all of them together, it's a pretty intense map. And that's all of the different flood risks layered on top of each other. So it's pretty intense, and you can kind of see why an area like this turned into this. And again, so this was back in January of this year, and caravans had been left underwater in the Bridgenorth area, and water was covering the road and a whole bunch of areas in the park area, as well as there were, you know, flood barriers in Iron Bridge nearby. So it's just a really good example to show you, again, when big flood events like this happen and you see stuff like this in the news, it usually tends to be because there's multiple types of flood risks apply to an area, which can then make flood risk really high and really complicated to model, but also unfortunately quite tragic in things like this. Now, that's pretty much it. So we promised that these were going to be short, snappy sessions. Hopefully you found these examples and a reminder of the different types of flood risks to be very helpful. In the next session, which will be next week, we're going to take a look at why flood searches are really necessary. So we'll look at common misconceptions about flooding, various case studies, examples, and what the cost of flooding really means and what the Law Society guidance is. The one thing I would also, talking about the different types of flood risks today. One thing I probably didn't get a chance to touch on is things like current and proposed flood defenses and the significance of historic flood risk events or flooding events. All of those play a factor, and all of those are also taken into consideration when we're looking at flood risk within our flood reports. Because if the Environment Agency has built any new flood defenses that an area would benefit from, then we will take that into consideration when we're looking at flood risk as well. So that's pretty much it for today. Like I say, next week we're looking at part 2 and why flood searches are necessary. So thank you very much for joining me for today's mini webinar. We hope you found it helpful. Any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and we'll try and get these answered for you either afterwards or during the webinar. And yeah, a little survey will launch at the very end of this. So thanks very much and have a great rest of the afternoon.